Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Richard Horowitz, and I am the co-host of this Dr. Talks Healing from Lyme Summit. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce to you a very good friend of mine, Dr. Christian Perron. Dr. Christian Perron is one of the leading infectious disease doctors in France and in Europe. He has worked for the French government. He's been a leading force on the edges of Lyme disease in France, helping patients who could not get help anywhere else. Christian, it is really a pleasure to see you today. Thank you for agreeing to do this talk. And please tell people a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into this with Lyme in France.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure for me also. I'm a professor of infectious and tropical diseases, but I'm recently retired now, but I'm still working, not with patients, but working for science and research and advocacy also. My background, I was a nominated professor of infectious disease in 1994, and I was the head of an important department of infectious diseases in a university hospital in the Paris area. But in my career, nearly half time, I worked for public institutions, and I was chairman of many important committees working for the Ministry of Health on subjects like infectious diseases, vaccination, and also I had some responsibilities at an international level. I was the vice chairman of the ETAGE group. ETAGE was the official committee of experts for vaccinations in the European region of WHO, the World Health Organization. But this European region is much wider than the European Union. It's a very big Europe, including Russia, all the republics in Central Asia, Israel, Turkey, and also countries in Northern Europe or Eastern Europe, not included in the EU. So I had many responsibilities. And why did I work on Lyme disease? Because when I started my career, in my department, I saw many patients, and the professor who worked before me, unfortunately, he died when he was rather young. He was a leader of Lyme disease in France, and he traveled a long time ago in the United States. He learned about this disease, and he came back in France with kids to practice serology, to practice culture of Borrelia, and so I learned a lot from him. And when I saw patients, at the beginning, I was believing in the official status about this disease, but I rapidly realized that chronic patients with severe impairment could be really improved after a few weeks of antibiotic treatment, but most of them relapsed several weeks later, and I had to treat them several times. I didn't understand why, and why this was not recognized. And I tried to organize research groups with colleagues, including at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. At the beginning, they were very kind with me. They wanted to help. But rapidly, I saw that they were completely under pressure not to work on this topic. And I was very surprised as a scientist why only on this disease it's not possible to work like for other diseases.
Right. So there was a political aspect. You saw this from almost the very beginning. And in fact, the reason you had to do it is because you have compassion and cared for patients. And could you speak just a little bit? I mean, from what I know, the epidemic in Europe for Lyme and tick-borne is really bad. So could you talk a little bit about what's happening in France with Lyme disease, rest of Europe? How bad is the epidemic there?
If you look at the numbers for a decade ago, and it's the same thing in the US, the epidemic is really increasing. But the problem in France, the report of the disease is not mandatory. Most of the physicians don't report about Lyme disease. There are no statistics since 2020, because the only disease in the world is COVID-19, but the other diseases do not exist. And if I look at the official data, it's it's really terrible because they say there is only 60,000 cases in France for 1 year. In fact, I think there are at least 10 times more patients. The number of officially hospitalized patients is a few hundreds for 1 year. It's completely stupid. It's not the reality. But as we know that the serology is not good at all the statistics are based on the results of the serology. So the search for antibodies created by the patient when he is infected by Borrelia. So I don't believe in these statistics, but we know that there are more and more patients in Europe. And it's only we have to speak about all the diseases vectored by tick bites, because it's not only Lyme disease. And I can speak later about 2 studies that we published in the medical literature with colleagues and with a veterinarian lab. We could practice PCRs, so a test which amplifies the microbes in the blood or the matrices. And we could find that, in fact, Borrelia are not the most frequently isolated bacteria. And we find much more of bugs, let's say bacteria or parasites.
Right. And in fact, there were 2 studies which I've read of yours, of course, that were very strong. One, that there's no gold standard right now because we have all these different species of Borrelia. You have Afzelii for aquadermatitis chronica matrophans, you have Guarini for neurobiliosis, but you've got all the other species like Valsana and all the others that are not picked up on standard antibody. And I think one of the PCRs you did, you're talking about Borrelia miyamotoi, that you also found relapsing fever in these people that the standard testing doesn't even find, right?
So Borrelia miyamotoi, it has a Japanese name because it was discovered by a Japanese guy a long time ago in rodents. And then it was very poorly studied in humans. But several years ago, there were several papers in Europe, in North America, saying that these studies showed that we could isolate Borrelia miyamotoi in some patients with chronic conditions. So we did this study in France. At that time, the National Reference Center for Borrelia, which is not doing a good job, unfortunately, said, no, there is no case in France. It's just Japanese stuff or an American stuff. There is no case in Europe. But several publications showed that the ticks in northern France, in Europe, could harbor Borrelia miyamotoi with a rather high frequency. So I said, it's bizarre. Why the ticks are infected and not the humans? And then we performed this PCR study, and we found the largest number of patients with chronic conditions with Borrelia miyamotoi. There was a previous study from Russia in Siberia showing acute cases of Borrelia miyamotoi after the tick bite. But in our study, it was chronic patients. And what was surprising, few of them had erythema migrans, so it's different Borrelia. And Borrelia miyamotoi is an intermediate bacterium between the Lyme disease complex, like Borrelia burgdorferi, sansulato, and so on, and the relapsing fever complex of Borrelia. There are many Borrelia in the world giving relapsing fever. And in our cohort of patients, more than 40 patients, half of them had dysregulations of their thermic balance. They had fever, chills, episode of they feel cold and or with flushes also. So because in relapsing fever, it's a fever which relapses regularly, and there was some same clinical pattern in these Borrelia miyamotoi patients. And our reference center said in France, oh, don't worry, the serology of Borrelia burgdorferi is so nice that it can diagnose also all the cases of Borrelia miyamotoi, but that's fake news, because we showed that in fact most of our patients didn't have a positive serology for Borrelia burgdorferi.
Right. Yeah. So the problem is it can't pick it up. And of course, it's the immunosuppressed patients, right? Those are the ones that get the worst cases of Borrelia miyamotoi. And a lot of the elderly patients, if they're on drugs like rituximab or immunosuppressants, they're the ones that especially, right, have to be careful. Now, we were talking about Lyme and relapsing fever. What about other species like how many Babesia, Bartonella, tularemia, Q fever? Are you seeing a lot of Ehrlichia and like all the ones that we're seeing? Because in ticks in France, there was a study years ago that co-infections were the rule, right? Not the exception, that the ticks there contained like 40 different species. Are we seeing this clinically?
The first bacterium we discovered was Mycoplasma, and then it was Rickettsia, different species, and Ehrlichia, much more than Borrelia, but they are never diagnosed in current practice because Mycoplasma, you have a serology for some species, but they are not. They have not a wide spectrum for detection. Ehrlichia is rarely diagnosed, but in fact it is frequent. And we were very surprised also to see that parasites were very frequently isolated. So Babesia is well known, but Babesia is a pyroplasm. Pyroplasm is it's a cousin of Plasmodium falciparum, or the Plasmodia responsible for malaria.
Malaria, yes.
But there is another pyroplasm which was not known in human medicine, called Theileria. And Theileria are well known by vets because they are frequent infections in animals in the country, especially horses, and they know different species of Theileria. And at that time, there was a lab in France. They published that if they put Theileria on human cells in culture, these cells could be transformed in cancerous cells. And if you remove Theileria, they became sane cells again. So I was surprised by that. And I spoke about Theileria with my vet colleague who did the PCRs. And one day, he was listening at me, but not really thinking it was a good thing to search these parasites in humans. But one day he phoned me and he said, "Oh, Christian, I was identifying, searching for bugs in a woman, but I made a mistake. I used the horse kit instead of the human kit, including Theileria, and I found Theileria in this woman." So I said, "You should add Theileria detection in," and that we did in when we made the succeeding publication, and we found a high amount of Theileria parasites in humans.
So Christian, this is fascinating because I've wondered about this for a long time because we have many patients that have malaria type symptoms of sweats, day sweats, night sweats, chills, flushing. It's not Babesia microti. It's not Babesia duncani. Now they're talking about maybe Babesia oticolii, which has been found in Canada. It's being debated. And I've wondered about Theileria species, but I didn't realize that they had actually found them in humans. This is a question I've had. You'll have to send me this publication because I don't believe I've seen it. And this is really important because it explains why Mepron and Zithromax may not be working. It's not just resistance to Babesia microti by genetic changes. It may be other pyroplasms that are causing people to be sick.
So I published that, so I will send you the references. And I think it's the same thing in your experience, clinical experience. I saw frequently that patients who improve partially with antibiotics, also hydroxychloroquine, I used a lot, and other drugs. Some of them responded much better with anti-malarial drugs. So I think that Babesia, maybe Theileria and others are, in some conditions, important bacterial, I'd say, actors in the disease.
Yes. So you also brought up a point very interesting about mycoplasma. It's been found in ticks, and not just the Mycoplasma pneumoniae. When we did our studies, it was Mycoplasma fermentans, Mycoplasma penetrans. Like, you don't find these species unless you do a PCR. These were atypical Mycoplasma species that were showing, which could also explain why some of these intracellular drugs, like doxycycline, azithromycin, make them better, but you can't pick it up on serology, right? These are kind of atypical species.
And the problem with all these bugs, we have not a reliable diagnostic test. When I realized these studies with some colleagues, we did it with a vet lab, as I said, because all the human labs didn't want to collaborate. They were under pressure, saying, no, Lyme disease does not exist, the co-infection do not exist, and so on. This lab, they accepted that we did the study because it was an official clinical trial, which was declared with an ethical committee and the promoter and so on. So it was okay for the authorities, but the lab is not allowed now. The study is finished and published for 2 years. They are not allowed to practice this test for humans. They had some strong attacks from the French Drug Agency to forbid the realization of this test for humans. So it's terrible because we discovered things very important, but we are not allowed to use this test for our patients. For me, it's something horrible because
No, I know that the medical, you and I have discussed this previously, the medical politics of this disease. And when you and I both got out of medical school, I think we came from it. We've discussed this, like, with the really good motivation of we're here to help patients, we're here to make a difference in the world. And then all of a sudden, you discover a disease where people want to close their eyes. I don't hear anything. I don't see anything. You can't speak it. It's terrible. It's affected patients across the world. And as we know, many French patients have had to go out of the country, right, to be able to get help.
Oh, and then just to finish with PCR, it's not a perfect test, of course. The sensitivity is not 100%. I agree completely, but it's better than nothing. And what was important in our studies, we showed that it was also interesting to look at the bugs, bacteria or parasites, even viruses, not only in the venous blood taken in a sample from your vein in your arm, but also to look at the capillary blood. You know, you make a little puncture at the end of the finger, like for a diabetes test. Also to look in the urine, saliva, and if you look in the different fluids, you can see that, for example, for some bugs, it's much easier to isolate them in the capillary blood than in the venous blood. I remember a communication by Ehrlich. You know, there is an American researcher who is working on Lyme and co-infections named Ehrlich. He's a far family from the great Ehrlich, the German guy who described Ehrlichia. And he presented, I remember, in an international conference, the fact that in the capillary network from surgery samples, he could discover many bugs that were trapped in the net of the capillary network. And we saw the same thing, for example, I don't remember which bacterium precisely, but some bacteria are discovered more frequently in the capillary blood than in the venous blood. I think if you want to fish a small fish in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, is difficult due to the current, but the capillary network is like a trap, and you have probably it increases the concentration of some microorganisms. It's a very interesting approach, and also we found even Borrelia more frequently in urine, and urine cannot be a contamination because it's in saliva. Saliva, of course, people may say, oh, it's an open milieu, it can be contaminated from outside, but we know that the salivary glands some pieces detached from the gland regularly, containing a lot of microbes. And to be sure about that, it would be necessary to realize biopsies of the gland in addition to the salivary test, but it's not possible ethically. But I'm convinced that for some bugs, when we find them in a high concentration in saliva, it's not a contamination from the outside, but it's a secretion, like for Epstein-Barr virus, for example, coming from the inside, from the blood.
Um, Christian, if people have questions for you at all on European Lyme, is there an email or a best way to contact you at this point?
Yes, I will give you my email. Okay.
Great. Yes, can you tell us now? We can, this way people can.
Christian.perron@gmail.com.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Good. You know, you brought up something interesting about finding the bugs, and you had published earlier with some of your colleagues about maybe opening up biofilms. You were talking about capillaries and how they're stuck in the net. But you also published in Medical Hypothesis, and I don't think anyone's followed up on this, and this is an important issue, that these organisms can be under biofilms like Lyme and Bartonella, but we maybe should be using biofilm agents to open up the biofilms and try and increase the ability to find them. That was a very interesting study, and I think people really need to follow up on this.
And unfortunately, the biofilm products who could work are not very effective. They work a little bit like serrapeptase or bromelain, or coming from pineapple, and you have some natural products who have such effect. But I think that orally they are not well absorbed by the intestine, and they are not very effective. But we could see that using, for example, serrapeptase, if we did several PCRs at 48 hours interval after the use of a biofilm breaker, we have a little increase in the sensitivity of the test. So I think it's a good way to progress, but unfortunately we have not very potent drugs to break the biofilms by the oral route.
Yes.
There's an excellent biofilm breaker, it's EDTA, but it can be used only by the IV route, and it's because we know there are studies, on catheters, people who are wearing catheters for long durations, several weeks or months, they have biofilms in the chamber. If they have regularly inoculations of drugs for chemotherapy for cancer, for example, and in this chamber you have thick biofilms, and when you analyze them, you can have a staphylococci of bugs. And there were studies showing if you flush in the IV line EDTA, it cleans immediately all the biofilms, but it's not possible to use EDTA like that in humans. So it's an interesting way of research, but I have not the solutions at the present time.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you bring that up with EDTA. The approach that we've taken, because we don't have enough really good studies on how to combine them, is I use multiple biofilm agents when I use Dapsone, like cinnamon clove oregano oil, biocidin, stevia, peppermint oil. But I have used EDTA suppositories, not IV, but I have used them 750 milligram suppositories. They're called detoxamin. Now, I don't have good scientific proof how well. I know it gets into the bloodstream because we've used it for lead chelation when I don't want to use, IV EDTA or DMSA. But it's an interesting question you bring up as far as could we improve, right? Finding these bacteria, looking in the microcapillaries, opening up the biofilms with it's a great question. I want to bring you back just to two organisms you brought up, which we don't see in America, and I think they deserve a little bit more information. You were talking about one of these organisms relating to cancer, and I know in Europe they found Candidiasis, I think it's called micorensis, right? Neorlichia micorensis, which is a bacteria we don't have here, which was causing like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma-type symptoms and autoimmunity. And then you also have a rickettsia species, Rickettsia helvetica, which we don't have here. Could you speak a little bit about these? Because there's a lot of controversy about these, and we don't have them in America as far as we know.
So this Ehrlichia mycorrhizis was also described in Japan at the beginning. So my colleagues at the National Reference Center say, no, it's stupid to study that because it's a Japanese stuff. There are no cases in Europe. But in fact, there were cases published in, I remember, in Holland and other countries, a few studies, a few cases in Sweden, I think. And Muriel Vesietosa, who is a vet researcher in France, published several years ago a study. She collected many ticks in the Ardennes, at the border of Belgium and in northern part of France, in an area with big forests. And she found a significant proportion of ticks harboring Neo-Ehrlichia mycorrhizis. So I said it's not possible that there are the ticks. Why there are no human cases? And in fact, in our studies with PCR, we found some cases of Neo-Ehrlichia mycorrhizis. So it was more isolated in people with the autoimmune disease, lymphoma. Probably could be a cause or one of the causes of these diseases in some cases. So the others said, no, it's just because people are immunosuppressed, we isolate this bug. It's another option, but I think they could play a role in these immunosuppressive diseases and possibly some cases of cancer. So I think it's important to continue to study this bug. I thought there were a few cases in North America, so it's important to look at that.
Yeah, the reason it's fascinating is the last couple of years, we knew that like H. pylori is associated, right, with, B-cell lymphomas in the stomach, but then Lyme was starting to be associated with, B-cell lymphomas. Bartonella has been associated with it, but then all of a sudden Bartonella is coming on the scene, associated with melanoma, inflammatory breast cancer, right? So it brings up the question, how many of these organisms, these bacteria, we know virus has been associated with cancer forever, right? Hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV. There's many of them, certain herpes viruses, HPV. But bacteria, I don't think it's received the same. So it's a question in Europe. If you get, for example, Ehrlichia mycorrhizis, doctors are never going to look for Lyme or Bartonella or this organism in a cancer patient, right? They'll just say, oh, you have a lymphoma, you have an autoimmune disease, let's just treat it with, the drugs they use. But it's a question of maybe we're missing, right, some essential elements.
It's proven that some lymphomas, especially digestive lymphomas, are linked with a bacterium infection. And I could, in my experience, patients with chronic Lyme who had a kind of Hodgkin's disease or lymphoma, some improved a lot with doxycycline. And so I was obliged to, because the family wanted these patients to go to a hematology for a classical treatment for lymphomas. I couldn't impeach that, but I had the conviction that probably they could have been at least in a better condition, and why not cured with a prolonged antibiotic or a combined antibiotic antiparasitic treatment. But unfortunately, we are not allowed to make research about that. It's a taboo.
And of course. And by the way, so also getting back to Rickettsia helvetica, early on when Willy Bergdorfer was initially, describing like what was happening after Alan Steer discovered it, I believe that organism, it came up as Rickettsia helvetica. But can you talk a little bit in Europe, because we really don't hear, we hear obviously about Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Coxiella burnetii Q fever, typhus. We don't really discuss, and Rickettsia parkeri now is, for example, in the boroughs like Queens, kind of the Gulf Coast tick moved to our area. But can you talk a little bit about the Rickettsia helvetica and maybe its effect in Europe? I don't think people know about it.
I find many cases of Rickettsia helvetica, but I think you have read the book by Chris Newby about the lab of Willy Bergdorfer, who he modified some bugs. And she said from the archives of Willy Bergdorfer that he created this bug from Swiss Rickettsia species and from crossed with American Rickettsia from the Rocky Mountains. And at that time, he called it the Swiss agent. In his book, it was written in French because Burgdorfer was a German Swiss before coming in America, but he spoke better French than English at the beginning. So he wrote his notes in his books in French, and he called it l'agent suisse, the Swiss agent. But I discovered that this bug was created by man. I was fascinated when I saw that. But I think because in her book, she said that at the first Lyme epidemic, the only bug that was published was Borrelia burgdorferi. But in fact, she said that most of the patients of the first epidemic also harbored the Swiss agents, Rickettsia helvetica. So it may be frequent in Northern America now. I don't know exactly. But in Europe, even some of the genes are coming from Switzerland. We don't see many cases.
Okay. Right. So it's one of these things that really needs more exploration. Can you also speak a little bit about Bartonella? We're finding at this point a lot of Bartonella. There was only one study that I'm aware of in Ixodes ricinus ticks that they transmitted Bartonella bertolisi. It was the only species. I don't know why they haven't done more, gotten more information and done more experiments on it. But can you speak a little bit? Do you see Bartonella in the patients in France?
They are fascinating bacteria, and we just focus on the cat scratch disease, Bartonella henselae, or Bartonella, the trench fever. Only a few numbers of species that were known previously in the medical history, and there are serology only for these two species. But in fact, there are many other Bartonellas in humans. And Muriel Vessier-Tossa published also several years ago a paper by PCR in humans using vet kits. She discovered several species of Bartonella well known by the vets, but that had never been described in humans before. But it was published, confirmed at that time by Didier Raoult in Marseille, who confirmed her results. It was published in Emerging Infectious Diseases, but nobody cared about that, and nobody is searching for these different species. And what is fascinating about Bartonella, there are a very good team in North Carolina. It's a vet university group. They published a lot about psychiatric conditions induced by Bartonella infection, including schizophrenia and other severe neurologic or psychotic diseases. And also you spoke about it. It seems to be an important factor of development of malignant melanoma. So I think Bartonella are very frequent bacteria involved in chronic conditions, but the diagnostic tools are very bad.
Yeah, we have to use the Bartonella fish test, either from IGeneX or T-Labs to find it. We use the Bartonella immunoblot from IGeneX, but it's true, the regular labs only check Bartonella henselae, Bartonella quintana. Very difficult. There's up to 17 pathogenic species. And, again, it's a frequent co-infection we're seeing that is interfering with the success of 8 or 9 weeks of dapsone therapy. We need to pulse it. But so you probably are seeing a lot more in France. And again, it's one of these big areas we just need more research, especially in Europe. Can you talk a little bit about the viruses? Because here, we have Powassan, but there you've got tick-borne encephalitis virus. You've got Congo Crimean hemorrhagic fever. There was an outbreak in Spain. Can you talk a little bit about the viruses and even the vaccine, since you're an expert in it? I know that they have a vaccine in Europe, right, for tick-borne encephalitis, but we don't, of course, have one here.
In France, it was considered very rare, only a few cases in Alsace at the German border, while it's rather frequent in Germany, especially in Bavaria or in Sweden, in northern countries. But in fact, even the National Reference Center for Borrelia recognized it. The number of cases is increasing in France. And they discovered a few cases far from the German border in the central part of France. So it remains a rare disease, but it's a frequent disease in Sweden, for example. Yes. So we discovered also by PCR some rare cases of West Nile virus. And I think it was a woman in the eastern part of France who who was breeding horses. So we know that this virus is a common can be found in horses, and she developed meningitis, encephalitis, and we could isolate West Nile virus in her CSF, spinal fluid. So it remains rare, but I think there are some cases, including in France, but there is no big study to confirm that.
Right. And also unpasteurized goat milk, right? I've read that it's one of the rare cases it could be transmitted. So again, you're feeling like it's one of those areas we need a lot more research. It's just not being studied enough, because these are flaviviruses in general, like West Nile, Zika, Powassan virus. They can be chronic persistent. For at least for Zika and West Nile, we're not sure with Powassan, but it probably is. And then it's a question is, what are these chronic flavivirus infections, right, doing to people's brains, right? It's an unknown.
And that's why I'm not convinced that the new Lyme vaccines will be very efficient, because we know that the Lymerix, which was marketed in the US several years ago, it was withdrawn because it induced severe reactions. My hypothesis, it was used in adults in Massachusetts or Connecticut, in area where the epidemic was at a high level. So vaccine was inoculated in patients who already harbored this bacteria. And it probably the immune reaction made that some symptoms came out. And because it induced some symptoms like the disease, the Lyme disease. And so it was withdrawn. I think they will have the same problems now. And it was only against Borrelia burgdorferi sensu stricto. Now they included several species of Borrelia. So maybe it will be a progress, but I think that it will not resolve all the problem, because we know now that the majority of the bacteria, the parasites involved in these chronic conditions are not Borrelia species. So it will be a great limit to the interest of these vaccines, I think.
Yes. No, I mean, from what I've seen from the VLA15 from the Valneva sites, I mean, it looks like it's creating an immune response. They're not describing at this point that there are any major reactions like we saw before with the SmithKline-Beecham. But of course, you're right. I mean, it's also why I've never understood why they have not put more money into a tick spit vaccine. They've talked about it. It's like you could be blocking viruses like Powassan, tick-borne encephalitis virus, Babesia, if Bartonella is transmitted, Bartonella, all these Lyme species, with one vaccine, with a tick spit, and they keep talking about it, but it's not being marketed yet. And considering,
when I saw that several years ago, I was enthusiastic and said, "Oh yes, really a new field of research." If, as you say, there is no news about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw there was a report in Spain, this is back a year or two ago, that Congo Crimean hemorrhagic fever, I mean, we don't really hear much about it here, but that there was an outbreak going on in Spain and that it was even transmissible. It was concerning me. Was there anything that ever came of that, or it just kind of died out?
Worried about that because it was a few patients coming back from Africa, probably who were contaminated by tick bite in Africa. And there was very little number of secondary contaminations, but the epidemic stops very rapidly by the isolation of the patient. So there were a lot of, the disease was more mediatic than real, because when this phenomenon occurs, it's really very limited to a few little number of patients.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, with the amount of tick-borne infections we're seeing right now, the U.S. had estimated almost 500,000 cases back a year or two ago. Do you see climate change at this point, from your perspective, increasing the tick populations? Do you think it's getting worse over time?
I'm convinced that more than climate change, it's the disappearance of many animals. There are publications showing that in Europe, half of the birds have disappeared. Snakes, frogs, many animals who could eat ticks regularly are disappearing, probably due to the use of pesticides and chemical substances in agriculture. Nobody speak about that, but when I see, even in my garden, you know my house, I'm in the suburb of Paris.
I've been to your house where your wife we shared a lovely meal. We played guitar, singing silly songs. Yes, I know your house very well. It's a beautiful place.
You played guitar in the garden. So at that time, there were a lot of birds in the garden. Now I don't see birds anymore. Very few. There are not so many as a few years ago. So I'm convinced that there's a change in these animal populations, and it can play a role in the control of the tick proliferation.
Yeah, so it's a shame. I've seen also some of the studies that the animal populations are going down, but you're right. They've talked about the biodiversity of this planet, that within 20 or 25 years, we will have lost about 1/3 of the biodiversity, which we need obviously for food production and the rest. And all of these COP28, COP27, all of these different, conference of parties, they just recently said, oh, we'll finally start to maybe think about phasing out fossil fuels. But they just published yesterday in Nature that the sponges who've lived in the oceans for, I guess millions of years, we've already hit 1.5 degrees centigrade. This was just published yesterday, and that was the line in the Paris Accord, right, in 2015, that we should not go past that. So I didn't realize that you had seen the decrease in the species in Europe, that even personally you're already witnessing it.
The glyphosate is a terrible chemical product which is sprayed everywhere in the fields for agriculture. It should have been forbidden in Europe, but thanks to the lobbies, European Parliament voted that it can be used during 10 years more. So it's terrible, because we know that there are dangerous products in nature and political.
Right. And one of the ones, by the way, that no one wants to talk about either, I mean, we won't go in detail, but is really the fact that it's EMFs, right? That also we're not even sure with some of the studies that are now coming out on cell phone radiation with these newer towers. I see stories sometimes that, the birds are being affected, the animals are but no one's doing any scientific studies. And it's kind of like, how do you deploy a technology without understanding the broad effects on humans and animal species? And yet, money talks, and politics basically, determines what happens. But science is not always leading the charge here. And unfortunately, we've tried in the United States, and we've not really made much progress on this range. So it's one of those big unknown question marks. Is this going to be a big health problem? Some studies say that it is. I think there's a lot more to learn about it.
I would like to discuss about the political problem, because when I was president of many commissions in France, I could obtain from the HAS in France, it's a high authority for health. We had working groups, and I could obtain text in favor of the patients they acknowledge the existence of a persistent clinical forms, possibly due to tick bites. They authorized an empiric therapeutic test, to give an antibiotic if there is a suspicion, even if the serology is negative. So I obtained many things, very concrete and going in the good way. I asked for the creation of clinical reference centers in different parts of the country, but it was written when I was I wrote also this text with other people. It was written that these centers, in the steering committee, there should be representatives of the patients, of the Lyme patients, also representatives of the Lyme doctors who have experience, some GPs and so on. And in fact, I resigned from my positions in these institutions. The COVID crisis arrived, and the National Council of Physicians was very aggressive against all the physicians, and they used the COVID crisis to suppress everything about Lyme disease in France. And they created this clinical centers, but they are managed by infectious disease hospital specialists who don't believe in Lyme disease. So they see many patients in consultation, but they say, oh, sorry, Mr. Horowitz, you have not Lyme disease. It's a psychiatric, it's in your head. And it's terrible because they give a lot of money to these centers. They don't do any research or any good research. And for me, it's a shame because I have some friends who were fired from the Board of Physicians recently. One of my friends has lost his license for life. Some are threatened. And now it's terrible because we obtained a lot of things a few years ago. Many GPs took care of the patients. It was not an ideal condition, but it was going in the right way. And now it came back horribly. And Lyme patients in France are desperate because they don't find any. I know some friends who continue to follow some patients, but they are afraid and they say, no, I don't want to take care of more patients. So now patients are going to Switzerland, to Germany, to other countries. Maybe some come to see you in the US. For me, it's terrible because they use the COVID crisis to destroy everything about Lyme in France. And all
No,
what
it's a terrible situation. I mean, you and I have discussed this before. In the medical politics, this is the only disease I can think of where the medical politics, in the middle of an epidemic, Lancet Global Health, you know this, it published about 2 years ago that 14.5% of the global population has been exposed to Borrelia burgdorferi, and yet 1 out of 7 people, no, it's every country but France. It's every country but the United States, right? We're in the middle of an epidemic, and they've allowed Lyme politics at this point to be something that is interfering with doctors doing their jobs. So what advice? It's an excellent question. You know, when I visited you years ago, you arranged for me to meet with the ministre de Santé. We met with the health department, and I spoke in French for maybe a half hour, 40 minutes, showing them science. I know nothing came of it, and I know I was with you when we were meeting with the guidelines committee, right? I spoke a bit in that meeting too when some of the ILEDS doctors were there. I realized nothing's happened from it. What advice would you give at this point to European doctors who are seeing these patients? Because obviously you don't want to lose your medical license. You need to help patients. I mean, do you see a solution? I mean, I'm starting at the end of this year. I hope to start a multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial on dapsone to prove once and for all that we have a solution. And I think a randomized trial will convince people because you've got doctors like Dr. Joac in France, right? And even in the southern France, I saw that 1% of the people in nursing homes with dementia turned out to have Lyme disease, right? And they were able to get out of nursing homes. This was published years ago. But what advice do you tell doctors at this point or patients, because you're dealing with such really a horrible political situation?
For years, I dreamed about a good randomized study, and I wrote some studies. I presented these studies to have some funding, but every time it was rejected. We don't give funds for an imaginary disease. You know, that was the scientific rationale to block the funding. So that's terrible because it's difficult to progress. And I see now the French patients look for, they are not all doctors, but people who do naturopathy, phytotherapy, and other parallel medicines. But there is a law now, discussed at the parliament, to attack all the alternative medicines. And another terrible law, which is discussed this week at the parliament, they are planning a law. It was adopted by the Assemblée Nationale, the Chamber of Representatives, but it was opposed by the Senate, but it's coming back to the National Assembly. And in France, it's not like in the US, it's a National Assembly which has the last word if there is a difference between the two chambers. And the law says nobody, a physician or other people in the society, is authorized to give publicly a message against the national official health policy. Nobody is allowed to refuse a mandatory drug. And if you violate this law, you can have a 15,000 euros of a fee. You can go to jail. And it's France today. It's not a dream. It's the reality today. It's terrible. And the media don't speak about that. And people are anesthetized by this government. But it's terrible because it's not anymore a democracy for me.
Right. And, and I've always respected, that France and the French people are dear to my heart because I have good friends like you, other French people I know who really I love and adore. I love Europe, right? I almost lived in Europe. I almost did not come back to the United States because I had so many good friends in Belgium and in France. It's a wonderful place. And of course, democracy in France, you were one of the first countries, right, who really started the democratic movement. To hear that it is being suppressed, I think it's a terrible thing. So I think this randomized trial is maybe the only way we're going to be able to change the politics, unless you have other suggestions at this point, because people obviously they're forced to go out of France to get care, just as they are, by the way, in Canada and in many other countries. So I think this randomized trial on dapsone do you know any doctors at this point, when I do this trial, is there a center now, yourself or someone else, who might be able to do it in France so we can help the French people?
No, I don't think so, because now everybody is afraid in France. I know a physician in Switzerland. I won't give now his name publicly because he could have problems. But even in Germany, I was invited by the German Society of Borreliosis recently in Saarlouis, just behind the French border. I remember this society a few years ago. They were very numerous in the room with many young doctors. Now there are also persecutions against the German doctors. The number of participants was much lower. People were rather old. Because young doctors, they are told that don't go in this field. It's like a sect, dangerous people who are not scientific. Yes. So I can see that it's not only in France. Maybe in France it's stronger, but also in Germany it's a difficult situation at the present time.
Right. So really, patients really do not have good options. I was doing a study for a new publication, and I was looking at how many people suffer from chronic fatiguing illnesses now. If you combine chronic fatigue, myalgic encephalomyelitis, fibromyalgia, and long COVID, just forgetting about Lyme, just those three, it's 14% of the US population, and almost 50% of Europe at this point is dealing with these chronic fatiguing illnesses. And yet you don't see the authorities right at the top levels of government going, we have all this disability. Eventually, it's going to affect our economy. It's affecting the workforce because people are too tired to work. They have brain fog. They can't think. You would think that they would get together and say, we have a real crisis on our hands. Let's get together, look at the science and see what we can do. And yet you don't really see people coming together to do that. Why do you think that is?
Well, I would love about that, but it's difficult. And in fact, you're speaking about long COVID. It's terrible because I think that 30% of the patients who had a severe COVID condition during the first and the second wave, after that, the virus was much milder. People who were treated very early with hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, azithromycin, they didn't develop chronic COVID, the long COVID situation. But there are a lot of patients in France with long COVID. The internal medicine specialists, infectious disease specialists say, oh, yes, it exists, it's important, but it's a psychosomatic disease. The same thing. It's terrible.
In the publication, I'm looking at writing my third science book. We're in the process, and I had to do a review of COVID, of long COVID, to see how many factors on the 16-point MSIDS model that I've been using for Lyme, how many affect long COVID. It turned out all 16 factors, every one of them, viral persistence, viral reactivation, problems with the microbiome of the gut, leaky gut with mast cell, sleep disorders, environmental toxins with air pollution, mitochondrial dysfunction, POTS dysautonomia, adrenal. It's what really surprises me with what you just said. It's not psychosomatic. We've already proven that this is all published in the literature, but it's almost as if no one, like one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing because it's published, but no one's taking the information and putting it together. It's almost as if they're following Pasteur's postulate from the 1800s that there's one cause for one disease, right? It can't possibly be multifactorial. I mean, I think just even the paradigm shift of a one cause, one disease model to multifactorial, because even for long COVID, we know all 16 factors of the model I use has been published, but you're telling me they're telling French patients it's in their head. It's a terrible situation.
Uh, uh, all these diseases are not psychosomatic, I'm convinced, but psychological factors may play a role because, you know, as well as me, that some patients who were cured or in good condition, unfortunately, somebody is dying in their family, they're in a big stress, and they have a relapse within 2 weeks. So psychological factors may modulate the course of the disease. I'm convinced about that. It's not because of that the disease, the real cause is psychosomatic, and there is a confusion about that. And also what we realized in these chronic patients, you see, I probably saw the same thing. 20% are very happy rapidly with antibiotics. In a few weeks, they are cured, that they are very happy. 20% of the patients, I say numbers like that, not precise numbers, but relatively
an average.
A good common sense proportion. 20% it doesn't work at all, and the 60 other persons, there is a progressive good evolution of their condition, with sometimes alternance of periods of better condition and then worsening and so on. Mm-hmm. But in fact, it works. But antibiotics don't cure all the patients. And I could discover from my patients and from the discussing with other colleagues like you that other factors were important, like the what we are eating. Change in the food habits may have important consequences on the health status. Maybe, probably in some cases, heavy metals, pesticides, all the chemical molecules we find in industrial food and so on, and also, of course, a resistance to stress. It's not only infectious disease; it's multifactorial.
Yes. No. We agree. And I think that's where medicine has to change. And in fact, what's disturbing about what's happening with long COVID in France is there are studies now showing that some of these patients, Borrelia burgdorferi, has now been associated with a worsening of long COVID conditions. So by ignoring Borrelia burgdorferi in France and its effect, and everyone says, gee, long COVID's a problem, they're ignoring one of those multifactorial causes, which may in fact be Lyme, because it is being reported. And I'll be speaking to Bruce Patterson, who's an expert in long COVID. I'll be speaking to him about this. And Bruce and I have discussed this in the past, that Lyme seems to be playing a role. He's finding it in the long COVID patients he's seeing in the United States. So I think we have a lot more science to do here. So Christian, we're already at an hour. That was a very quick hour conversation. I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Can you please just tell people again, if they have any questions, they want to contact you, what is the best email at this point to contact you?
Christian.Perron@gmail.com.
Okay. Christian, you've been a good friend and a colleague for many years. I want to thank you personally for standing up. You were one of the few doctors who had the courage to stand up and speak out for the French people. There is nothing higher in my esteem than a physician like you who has put others before yourself and your own well-being to help others, that is the highest in medicine that anyone can accomplish. And I want to thank you and for all the sacrifices you've made. And, karma is perfect. What comes around goes around. And I know that you're going to be blessed by all of the work you've done. And I want to thank you again for taking the time today and again for being such a good friend. And I hope that you and I will be able to see each other soon in Europe and continue our conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very
Yes.
much. Pleasure for me also.
Yeah. So thank you everyone again for joining us for this Healing from Lyme Summit. I'm one of your co-hosts, Dr. Richard Horowitz. Thank you for joining us today. We've been speaking to Dr. Christian Perun on chronic Lyme disease and tick-borne infections in Europe. Thank you again. We'll be seeing you soon for another Healing from Lyme Summit.